I wanted to ask you now, getting more technical here. Are there guidelines for communication or for professionalism that you think are really unique to the research world or think undergrads struggle with that you'd like them to know when they get started?
That's such a great question. And, on the tail end of my response to your last question, I was just thinking, I didn't really respond to the point you made about how it can be intimidating to approach a professor or a doctoral student and, with questions or expressing interest in a particular research idea. And so, I think that that's a big barrier, and students should, I hope that students will feel comfortable doing this. All of us, everyone, all of my colleagues, professors really want you to talk to us. We have office hours for a reason. We want to engage with you. We love teaching. We are all devoted to the work we're doing. And I'll just say, the work that we do with students, graduate students and undergraduates alike it's one of the most rewarding parts of the job. And so, knowing that we're receptive, we want to hear from you. Please don't feel intimidated. And so reaching out in whatever capacity, email, going to office hours, doing that is so important. Once you're in a lab, there are, certainly, I think there are differences in terms of the in ways you communicate in everyday, social relationships with how communication operates in a lab. And I think a good guideline is kind of to, often labs will assign you a mentor or a supervisor, which is, often a graduate student or a postdoc, and following their lead is the thing to do. Or, finding someone you admire who's really succeeding, asking, how did you get into that lab? What's the social climate like? But I think it never hurts to err on the side of being a little more formal, especially until you know the lab. And when someone says it's okay to call the PI by their first name, I'm okay with that. But just want to make sure before you talk to the grad students, they will know everything. They know the lay of the land. Am I answering your question? Give me more
Oh,
guidance.
you absolutely are. I had wanted to follow up on that because you're giving us a really good idea, I think, of how to navigate that culture, right?
Mhm.
The fact that there are graduate students at this tier a little bit lower on the hierarchy who might feel less intimidating, but they also know Dr. Losh does have all of us call her Molly. We all know her first name for a reason. They might say something like that. And erring on the side of formality and highly professional is just good general advice. So I'm really glad we get to include that in this. One thing I'm wondering about is any unspoken rules that you found have surprised students, things that maybe stand out as like, oh, that was a weird social faux pas that I'm used to knowing, but it must not be as obvious to these other people if they're making this mistake. So
No,
if you could provide us insight on that.
so important to think about. Another wonderful question. And you don't know if you've never been in the lab before, so it's okay to make those mistakes. But if you know not to make them, it's good to avoid. And again, so talking to your supervisor, your grad student mentor about the culture of the lab, asking questions about, okay, is it okay to use my cell phone? That sort of thing is really just, it can help you avoid all of this. So I'll say that at the outset. But yes, there are things that have surprised me. So thinking, maybe thinking that time in the lab when you should be focused on working on data is maybe more social, just because oftentimes, especially in a friendly lab, of course there's conversation, and we're not just tied to our computers 24/7. But
We're human beings.
exactly. But I think so. It's not okay to have friends come to the lab, or excess socialization, loud voices. You need to think about the environment that you're in. So a lot of labs where we'll have the space where students are working also devoted to participant testing. And so you need to be aware that there can be, a family coming in, or a research participant, whether it's a family or, an undergrad, it could be a person with autism or a family coming in, and be ready to, be very professional. And if you're sitting there with your phone open, and a backpack slung over a chair, it's not professional. So
Yeah, I think those can be really subtle indications of the environment. And it
Mhm.
makes sense if you're used to studying in a library and used to sitting at your computer that
I'm
way.
sure.
You just wouldn't know. And no one's, if anyone watching this is thinking, oh gosh, I have done that and is feeling mortified, I feel like we all understand that that's not a thing you might know instinctively going into these settings, which is why this entire series exists.
Right.
So,
And I'm going to jump in and say, and be mindful of who might be listening when you are talking in the lab, especially as Dr. Losh said, when there are potential participants and family members nearby. Just always remind yourself of where you are and who can overhear anything that you say. So again, that professionalism is key, especially in the lab.
Yeah.
and
The importance of confidentiality, so professionalism, but aside from that, just, everything we do in the lab is highly confidential. So, you can't have videos up where you can see people's faces. And again, you should have a contact in the lab where you can ask questions, these are the things to ask questions about. Where can I do my coding? Are families coming in at this time? That sort of thing. Another thing to mention is that depending upon the department, the space that you're working in, sometimes there are labs right next to you that are doing highly sensitive research that, maybe so in my lab, for instance, we are just down the hall from people who do acoustic research. And if there's someone talking loud, or if you're gathering outside the lab in the hallway and gabbing, students do this, it happens. But when you're part of a lab, it's important to know about the research, the broader research community, I think, and where you are. And it's just a responsibility that we all have to respect our research community, and things like keeping your voice down, or knowing, oh gosh, they're doing this kind of very sensitive research here. Let's be aware of that. Similarly, people working with kids. Okay, there might be a little kid bolting out of that lab, and just to be aware of that. And if I encounter a family, to be able to help them to find a lab, that sort of thing is just a really wonderful way to become a part of a collaborative, broader research community, I think.
yeah, I think all of these things that you both are saying, these are challenges specific, I think, to human subjects research,
Exactly.
but also developmental science research.
Mhm.
Because when we're studying early development, we're working with families. We want parents to feel like this is a safe professional environment. And from a broader perspective, like you're talking about having a professional environment, not talking about your participants where they can hear you, or talking about other participants where the afternoon group can hear you. The biggest concern, I think, or one of the biggest concerns with this kind of research, is protecting participants' privacy and data, and respecting them. Like those are some of the biggest things that we can do wrong. And so all of these considerations you're mentioning, I do think really feed into that. Thinking about your subjects respectfully, or participants respectfully, and showing that with the way you talk and the way you behave.
And really, so when you're a part of a lab too, it's a responsibility. It's also kind of a privilege, to get to work with families in this way, even if you're not directly collecting data. You're working with data that these families have contributed and they've entrusted you with, and so taking ownership of helping to protect that data, helping to make sure that those data are treated with the care that these families are expecting. Absolutely.
And I think when you take that as a guiding principle, even with behaviors or things that don't seem as obviously wrong or bad or inappropriate, something like having your friend visit you at work is fine in a lot of environments, but it's not fine when it's a violation of participants' privacy and what you're doing is sitting at a desk coding. And so I can see why it's not obvious, and there's no judgment for that being news to anyone watching this. But at the same time, if my guiding principle is participant privacy and respect for the fact that they're sharing private information with me, then it makes me think, oh, maybe I wouldn't have my family come visit me in the lab, or I wouldn't have a friend come visit me for lunch. I would go to whatever designated area there is for visitors.
Or check with your supervisor, you know?
Always, right?
Check in with them. I think communication is such a big, should be a guiding principle. If there's a question, ask. A lot of labs have lab manuals so we have a lab manual that we give to every new person as we initiated them into the lab and on board, where we have, not the rules, but our guiding principles and really just the lab procedures. So we've laid it all out in writing, and everybody reads it, not everybody remembers it, but paying attention to those things. And then if a lab doesn't have something like that, asking those questions so that you're clear.
Yeah, and that really brings me to my next question, which is about guidelines for communication. Do you have certain expectations for how you'll have your mentees communicate with you? What are things that stand out about good communication?
Yeah. Maybe I would approach this from a different perspective, things that stand out when communication has gone awry maybe, or wasn't as.
We can learn lessons from the mistakes of others.
Exactly, yeah. And so I think lack of communication. So, adhering to a schedule, and if you can't meet a commitment, you have to communicate this, right? Because sometimes there are a dozen people depending on you to be a part of a meeting, or depending on you to, fill an important role. And so not showing up, not communicating with your lab supervisor or mentor, well ahead of time. Of course, changes happen, emergencies happen, that's fine. But in my experience, Northwestern undergrads are way overcommitted. That's just, they're all so amazing, so talented, they get involved in everything. And so that's a big thing in the lab, is that the people just have a lot on their plate, but maintaining that sort of open communication, so where if you can't meet an obligated commitment in terms of schedule or otherwise, communicating that very, very early on, so that people are aware and we're not all wasting time. I think if you're struggling, please, tell someone early on. Don't wait until, and we all have questions, and then we all get to a point in a project where we're wondering, oh my goodness, I'm not sure I understand this, or I've got some fundamental questions. I don't, what are the next steps? Don't wait until it snowballs. Ask questions early on. So people who have done this, people who have open communication, people who I think are communicating about their questions, their wanting to know really how what are the next steps in this project? Am I meeting expectations? It's okay and actually wonderful. It's refreshing to have those questions asked. How could I improve? Or in particular, I think students who so there's lots of reasons, and I'm sort of going on a tangent here and moving around. So bring me back, Amanda, if I'm going too far.
Yes, that's my job. Please continue.
Primary reasons to be involved in a lab, right? So you're looking for a letter of recommendation. You're looking for experience you can put on your CV, but also a really important reason to get involved in labs is to suss out your interests. Really you don't know how can you know whether you're interested in X career trajectory without getting some experience with that. And so the more you engage with that, the more questions you ask, the better off you are on all of those fronts. Stronger letters, having a better awareness of whether you actually are interested in what you're doing, and having something substantial to add to your CV. So really, I would say open communication is so important for getting the most out of your experience in a lab in a way that's going to benefit a student.
What I'm really hearing from you is that having that open and consistent communication helps facilitate a whole host of other things,
Exactly.
right? There's how the lab runs and how
Mhm.
smoothly your part of the research runs. That's a big reason to communicate often and openly.
Yeah.
But there's also, it ties into the bigger picture of how well you get to know the project, how involved you get to be, and how involved you want to be.
Yep.
Because it's hard if you're looking at medical school or clinical psychology or any other PhD to really know what that's like before you're doing it.
Exactly.
And some of these experiences in labs that work with clinical populations like yours or do really intensive human subjects research, yours is another great example of that. Those are some of the only ways to get that experience. And I think we are going to talk next about expectations and how to make the most of your experience. But it's true that professionalism, communication, all these fundamental skills are really important for being able to do that.
Exactly.
Right.
Yep.
So I think they're all good points.